The stench of stale institutional food clung to Jamal Rivers like a second skin, a constant reminder of the orphanage's suffocating embrace. At 13, Jamal was already too familiar with the sharp edges of the world, the way eyes narrowed and voices hardened when he, a black boy from the wrong side of town, dared to exist. Every day was a performance, a careful tightrope walk between invisibility and inevitable mockery. His skin, a rich mahogany, was a beacon for the bullies, a target painted on his back by the very people who were supposed to guide him. The orphanage, a crumbling relic of forgotten charity, was less a home and more, a holding pen, where the whispers followed him down corridors, festering into shouts in the yard. He was an orphan, doubly damned in their eyes, and his presence, a silent accusation of their comfortable lives, invited contempt. Today, the humiliation was a grand spectacle, orchestrated by the same boys who policed the orphanage's invisible caste system, led by Marcus, a lanky, cruel-eyed teenager with a penchant for psychological warfare. They cornered Jamal in the communal hall, their grins widening into predatory sneers. "Look what the stray cat dragged in," Marcus drawled, his voice a mocking imitation of the matron. "Still waiting for your fairy godmother, Rivers?" The hall was packed, the usual dinner chaos now a backdrop for Jamal's impending torment. Every scraped chair, every clatter of cutlery, amplified the dread in his chest. Jamal tightened his grip on his chipped plate, refusing to meet their gaze. He knew the routine, the taunts about his worn clothes, his lack of family, the impossible dream of a future beyond these walls. But today, Marcus had a new weapon. "Heard you got a girlfriend," Rivers, another boy, Liam, piped up, his voice cracking with feigned excitement. Laughter erupted, shrill and derisive. Jamal's ears burned. This was it. The rumors about Eleanor Graves, the grotesque whispers had started a week ago, after the old woman, a spectral figure draped in oversized, faded clothing, had visited the orphanage. She had requested to speak with him. Specifically, her face was a canvas of deep lines, her hair a wild, silver mane, and her eyes, though piercing, held a disquieting intensity. She was known in the impoverished corners of the city as the Hermit of Hawthorne Hill, a reclusive eccentric who had supposedly lost her mind after a scandal decades ago. The children, fueled by sensationalized gossip from the staff, believed she was a witch, a madwoman, or both. The marriage proposal itself had been an absurd, hushed affair, conducted in the orphanage's drafty reception room, supervised by a bewildered social worker. Eleanor, with an unsettling formality, had declared, "Jamal Rivers, I propose a union of purpose, a bond that transcends conventional understanding. Will you accept this arrangement?" Her voice, surprisingly deep and resonant, had echoed in the small room. Jamal, desperate for any escape from the orphanage's suffocating grip, had agreed, not understanding the true implications but grasping at the sliver of hope she offered. He saw it as a bizarre form of adoption, a ticket out. The social worker, bemused but also keen to offload one of the more difficult cases, had facilitated the paperwork, seeing only the legal loophole, not the peculiar undercurrents. Now, Marcus seized on the absurdity of it, twisting it into a public spectacle. A 50-year-old hag, Rivers, what, did she promise you her dentures? The boys around Marcus guffawed, their faces contorted in ugly glee. One boy, a younger kid named Kyle, who usually kept to himself, pointed a finger and shrieked with laughter. Even some of the adult staff, feigning indifference, let their gazes linger a moment too long, a subtle judgment in their eyes. Jamal felt a familiar shame spread through him, hot and suffocating. It wasn't just the age difference they mocked. It was the sheer implausibility of someone, anyone, wanting Jamal Rivers. It was the confirmation of his worthlessness, amplified by the grotesque nature of the deal. "Maybe she's got a secret stash of cookies," Liam snickered, earning more laughs. Marcus stepped closer. his shadow falling over Jamal. Or maybe she just likes little boys who don't talk back. Is that it? Rivers got yourself a sugar mama who can't see straight. The implication hung in the air, a vile accusation that stung more than any physical blow. Jamal's hands balled into fists, his knuckles white. He could feel the weight of every eye in the hall, every whisper dissecting his humiliation. He was a spectacle, an object of ridicule, his blackness and poverty magnified by the bizarre transaction. He wished for the ground to swallow him whole, for the walls to crumble and bury him beneath their debris. His vision blurred, not with tears, but with the searing anger that burned beneath the surface. He was tired of the endless mockery, the relentless chipping away at his dignity. He was tired of being the orphan, the black boy, the one nobody wanted. Eleanor, for all her strangeness, had offered him a glimpse of something else, a path, a wish from this suffocating existence, even if it was a delusion. It was his delusion, and they were trying to snatch it away. He looked up, his eyes, usually downcast, now burning with a defiant spark. Marcus faltered, surprised by the sudden intensity. She's giving me a home," Jamal stammered, his voice raw, barely above a whisper, yet resonating with an unexpected conviction that momentarily silenced the laughter. The words hung in the air, a fragile shield against the onslaught. It was a desperate plea for understanding, a raw declaration of his desire for belonging, however unconventional the means. But the bullies, sensing a crack in his resolve, rallied. "A home with that old witch," Marcus sneered, mimicking a cackle. "What kind of home? Rivers one where she boils you in a cauldron." The renewed laughter was louder, more vicious than before. It washed over Jamal, drowning out his fragile hope, the sheer audacity of his situation. A child marrying an elderly woman was a spectacle that even the adults found amusing in its absurdity. He had no retort, no clever comeback. The weight of their collective judgment pressed down on him, suffocating him. He was just Jamal, a boy with nothing, reaching for a lifeline. No matter how strange, the shame was a physical ache. Deep in his bones, he knew, with a chilling certainty, that this would follow him, a brand seared onto his identity. Every eye in the hall, every hushed conversation, painted him as the strange, pathetic orphan who sold himself to an old woman. This was his origin story, etched in the cruel laughter of strangers, and he carried it like a curse. He picked up his plate, food untouched, and walked away. Every step a defiant act of retreating into the shadows, the snickering following him like a relentless tide. The orphanage, with its faded paint and peeling wallpaper, suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in, trapping him in a world where prejudice and ridicule were the only constants. He had found a glimmer of hope, a bizarre escape, and the world had immediately conspired to make him pay for it. The mockery was not just about the odd marriage. It was about his audacity to believe he could escape his predetermined fate, a fate dictated by his race and his poverty. The cafeteria noise resumed, but for Jamal, it was a muffled hum, a background track to the throbbing humiliation in his ears. He was alone, utterly and irrevocably alone, clutching the fragile hope that Eleanor Graves, despite her strangeness, offered something real. And in that moment, a quiet resolve began to harden within him, a determination forged in the crucible of public shame. They could mock him, they could jeer, but they couldn't take away the faint, flickering ember of hope that Eleanor had ignited. He would endure this, just as he had endured countless other slights, because beyond this immediate pain lay the faint possibility of something different, something better. The humiliation was a test, a gauntlet he had to run. He just didn't know yet how high the stakes truly were. The memory of the cafeteria humiliation clung to Jamal as he lay on his cot, the thin blanket offering little comfort against the biting chill of the orphanage's unheated dorm. His mind, a relentless projector, replayed the sneers, the laughter, the dismissive glances of the adults. But this wasn't the first time. The tapestry of his short life was woven with threads of quiet endurance, each strand a testament to the myriad ways the world had sought to diminish him. He remembered his mother, a vibrant laugh in a drab world, her skin the same deep hue as his, her spirit unbowed even in the face of relentless hardship. She had worked 2 jobs, her hands calloused, her eyes often tired, but always, filled with a fierce love for her son. She had taught him to read, to dream beyond the cramped confines of their rented room, to believe in the boundless expanse of his own mind. "They can take your things, Jamal," she'd often say, her voice soft but firm, "but they can never take what's in here," tapping his forehead. "That's yours, boy. Guard it." Then the cough came, a persistent, hacking cough that rattled her thin frame. The trips to the free clinic became more frequent, the wait times longer, the doctors' faces etched with a weariness that mirrored her own. She called it a winter chill, but Jamal, even at 7, knew better. He saw the way she clutched her side, the faint sheen of sweat on her brow even on cool days. He heard the hushed conversations with the landlord about overdue rent, the frantic searches for loose change. He learned the language of unspoken suffering, the way a person could smile while their body betrayed them when she finally succumbed. It wasn't sudden. It was a slow, agonizing fade, like a vibrant sunset dissolving into the inky blackness of night. Jamal remembered the social worker's clipped, sympathetic tones, the cold, clinical efficiency of the process that transferred him from his mother's empty bed to the orphanage's stark reality. His first week at the orphanage was a blur of hostile stares and whispered insults. He was an anomaly, a dark-skinned boy in a predominantly white institution, an unwelcome addition to an already overcrowded system. The other children, quick to sense vulnerability, circled him like sharks. He was a new target, a fresh face for their ingrained prejudices. The staff, overworked and underpaid, saw him as another mouth to feed, another file to process. He remembered Mrs. Albright, a matron with a perpetually pinched expression, who would often mistake his name, calling him Jameson or Germain, a subtle but constant erasure of his identity. When he corrected her, she would sigh, a sound laden with weary exasperation, as if his very existence was an inconvenience. He learned quickly that silence was a safer bet than correction, that enduring small slights was preferable to inviting larger ones. One incident, in particular, solidified his strategy of quiet resilience. He was 8. A new set of art supplies had arrived. A rare treat. Jamal, who loved to draw, reached for the rich ochre crayon, imagining a vibrant landscape. Before his fingers could close around it, Marcus, then a scrawny, sneering 10-year-old, snatched it away. "That's for us," he'd snarled, his eyes narrowed with possessive malice. "You stick to the broken ones. Rivers. They match you better." The other children giggled. Jamal's heart pounded, a frantic drum against his ribs. He wanted to lash out, to scream, to reclaim what was rightfully his. But he remembered his mother's words, "Pick your battles, son. Some things aren't worth the fight." He saw the indifference in Mrs. Albright's eyes across the room, busy with paperwork. He saw the eager anticipation of the other children, waiting for a meltdown, a reaction they could further exploit. So he swallowed his anger, his humiliation, and picked up a stubby, broken black crayon. He drew in silence, pouring his frustration onto the page, creating a dark, brooding forest that was nonetheless beautiful in its intensity. He learned that day that some battles were fought not with fists or shouts, but with an internal fortitude, a quiet refusal to let their cruelty break him. He would not give them the satisfaction of his tears or his anger. He would endure. This strategy served him through countless acts of casual racism and overt bullying. He was frequently blamed for things he didn't do. His denials met with skepticism and dismissive waves of a hand. When a window in the recreation room was broken, despite him being miles away on an errand and all, Mrs. Albright's eyes immediately flickered to him. "Jamal, you know how expensive repairs are," she'd said, her voice heavy with implied accusation. He knew better than to argue, the weariness in her voice a clear signal that his innocence mattered less than her desire for a quick resolution. He simply nodded, a phantom guilt settling over him. He learned to become a ghost, to blend into the background, to make himself as small and unremarkable as possible, a desperate attempt to avoid the spotlight of their prejudice. He poured his energy into reading, into escaping into the worlds found within books, his mother's final gift. Books became his sanctuary, a place where he wasn't the impoverished black orphan, but a knight, an explorer, a wizard. The deeper reason for his endurance, for his carefully constructed silence, was a profound and crushing fear of being utterly alone. The orphanage was bleak, but it was a known entity, the outside world, without his mother, without a protector, seemed a vast and terrifying expanse. He saw other children, older ones, age out of the system, disappearing into the void, often reappearing months later, broken and defeated, their fleeting hopes extinguished. He didn't want to be like them. The marriage to Eleanor Graves, as bizarre as it seemed, offered a concrete alternative. It was a tangible lifeline, however slender. It was a chance to leave this suffocating place, to escape the constant scrutiny and the ingrained prejudice that permeated every corner of his existence here. He knew people would mock him, as Marcus and the others had done. He knew it would be strange, perhaps even unsettling, but the prospect of remaining in the orphanage, of slowly suffocating under the weight of their judgment and the crushing certainty of a bleak, predictable future, was far more terrifying than any eccentricity Eleanor Graves could possess. He didn't care about the whispers, the jeers, the speculation about Eleanor's motives or his own. He cared about escape. He cared about the chance, however slim, to build a life where he wasn't constantly defined by his poverty or his race, where his identity wasn't perpetually reduced to a label of orphan or problem child. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Guard what's in here. He had guarded his inner world, his dreams, his quiet resilience. And now he was guarding this fragile hope, this peculiar arrangement that promised freedom. He had endured so much, learned to survive by bending rather than breaking. The humiliation in the cafeteria was just another gust of wind against a sapling that had learned to root itself deep. To withstand the storms, he would accept the mockery, absorb the insults, because the potential reward, the tantalizing whisper of a new beginning, was worth any amount of public shame. He had learned that survival sometimes meant accepting a strange, unconventional path, especially when all conventional paths were closed off to him. And Eleanor Graves, with her odd proposition, represented that strange, unconventional path, a chance he couldn't afford to ignore. He would face the mockery, for the promise of a future beyond these walls. The battered Ford pickup, an anachronism in the affluent, tree-lined streets of Hawthorne Hill, pulled up to the imposing wrought iron gates of Eleanor Graves' estate. Jamal, clutching a worn backpack that held his few worldly possessions, felt a tremor of trepidation and anticipation. The gates swung open with a slow, deliberate groan, revealing a long, winding driveway flanked by ancient, gnarled oaks. The house, a sprawling Victorian manor, loomed at the end, its dark windows like watchful eyes. It was a stark, breathtaking contrast to the cramped, desolate orphanage, a jump from stark concrete to overgrown grandeur. The air itself felt different here, heavy with the scent of damp earth and old money, a world away from the stale air and disinfectant of his past. Eleanor, surprisingly, drove the vehicle herself, her hands, though gnarled with age, steady on the wheel. She wore a faded, yet impeccably tailored, tweed jacket and thick-rimmed glasses that magnified her already intense gaze. Her usual disheveled appearance had been replaced by a quiet dignity, almost regal. "Welcome, Jamal," she said, her voice softer than he remembered, devoid of the strange formality of her proposal. "This will be your new home. Her words were a balm, a stark antidote to the bitter mockery he had faced. He nodded, unable to articulate the whirlwind of emotions, relief, fear, and a profound sense of the surreal. Life with Eleanor was, predictably, unconventional. The house was a labyrinth of dusty rooms, filled with towering bookshelves, antique instruments, and strange, whirring contraptions covered by white sheets. She kept to a strict schedule, rising before dawn, spending hours in a secluded wing of the house that Jamal was implicitly forbidden to enter. Her meals were Spartan, often eaten in silence in a cavernous dining room that echoed with every clink of cutlery. She rarely offered direct instruction, communicating instead through cryptic remarks or pointed observations. Observation is the purest form of learning. Jamal, she'd once mused, watching him struggle with a particularly complex geometry problem. Not all answers reside in textbooks. Despite the opulent surroundings, Jamal found that escaping the orphanage didn't mean escaping judgment. The news of the marriage had, predictably, seeped into the insular, upper-crust community of Hawthorne Hill. It was never overt, never shouted, but it was there, a palpable undercurrent of disdain and suspicion. When Eleanor enrolled him in the local private school, a prestigious institution filled with children whose families had generations of wealth, the covert discrimination became apparent. The admissions officer, Mrs. Albright's more polished counterpart, had offered strained smiles, her eyes lingering on Jamal's dark skin a fraction too long, her questions subtly probing Eleanor's benevolence. Such a generous act, Miss Graves. She'd purred, her voice dripping with insincerity. Especially given the unusual circumstances of your guardianship. At school, he was not the orphan, but the charity case, the old woman's strange ward. The children, raised in gilded cages, mimicked their parents' prejudices with unnerving precision. He overheard whispers in the hallways. Did you hear about Graves? She adopted that boy from the city orphanage. Adopted, my mother said they got married. It's scandalous. Their parents, who held lavish galas and sat on charity boards, were masters of veiled contempt. Playdate invitations never materialized for him. His art teacher, Davies, an otherwise jovial man, frequently praised his innate rhythm when he wasn't doing anything rhythmic. A subtle but grating stereotype, when he excelled in science, a subject he found fascinating. His achievements were met with surprise rather than genuine acknowledgement, as if intellectual prowess was an anomaly for someone of his background. Eleanor, while distant, was keenly aware of these social currents. She rarely addressed them directly, but her actions spoke volumes. One afternoon, after Jamal had recounted a particularly frustrating encounter with a classmate who had questioned his right to be at the school, Eleanor had simply placed a thick, leather-bound volume in front of him. It was a history of civil rights, filled with stories of resilience and defiance. Knowledge is power, Jamal, she'd said, her eyes fixed on his. And understanding the patterns of human behavior allows one to anticipate and deflect. Yeah, it wasn't comfort, but it was guidance, a subtle nudge towards intellectual empowerment. Jamal's greatest challenge wasn't the explicit cruelty he had faced in the orphanage, but the insidious, almost invisible prejudice of this new world. He longed for true acceptance, for a place where he wasn't constantly defined by his past or his unconventional present. The humiliation from the orphanage still gnawed at him, making him wary, hesitant to trust. He walked the grand hallways of Eleanor's house, in the polished corridors of the elite school, feeling like an alien, an unwelcome intruder. He tried to live normally, to fit in, to master the complex curriculum and the unspoken rules of this new social stratum. He studied diligently, absorbed information like a sponge, trying to prove his worth, not just to Eleanor, but to himself and to a world that seemed determined to dismiss him. The systemic abuse here was more subtle, more pervasive. It wasn't a broken window blamed on him, but a subtle implication that his presence lowered the school's academic standards. It wasn't a direct insult, but the absence of genuine interaction, the polite yet firm social barriers. He learned to read between the lines, to discern the thinly veiled contempt in a forced smile or an overly enthusiastic compliment. He realized that the marriage was not just a source of ridicule for the orphanage bullies. It was a convenient handle for the elite community to justify their existing prejudices against him, a way to mark him as other. One evening, Eleanor found him in the vast, echoing library, hunched over a book on advanced physics. She observed him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "The world is complex, Jamal," she finally said, her voice soft. "It seeks to categorize, to simplify. Do not let it define you. Let your mind be your compass, your curiosity, your shield." She then revealed a hidden compartment in the wall, pulling out a faded photograph. It showed a younger Eleanor, vibrant and brilliant, standing beside a formidable-looking woman who bore a striking resemblance to her. "This is my mother," Eleanor explained, her voice tinged with a rare flicker of emotion. "She taught me that true strength lies not in conformity, but in embracing one's unique path, however unconventional it may seem." This fleeting moment of vulnerability from Eleanor was a rare glimpse behind her eccentric facade, a silent acknowledgement of the shared burden of being different. Jamal knew Eleanor saw something in him, something beyond the scorned orphan that the world saw. He didn't understand what it was, or why she had chosen him. He only knew that this strange alliance, born of desperate need and cryptic intentions, was his best, perhaps his only, chance. He still felt the sting of humiliation from the orphanage, the subtle slights of the new school. But beneath it all, a quiet fire had begun to burn. He was learning, observing, adapting. The superficial ridicule was just noise. The real challenge lay ahead, a challenge that Eleanor, in her own enigmatic way, was preparing him for. He was an outsider, yes, but perhaps being an outsider was exactly what he needed to be. The grand house, the complex studies, Eleanor's cryptic pronouncements, they were all pieces of a puzzle, and Jamal, despite his lingering insecurities, was determined to solve it. His endurance was no longer just about survival, it was slowly evolving into a quiet, purposeful defiance. He was in this new world, navigating its subtle cruelties. But he was no longer a victim. He was a student, a survivor, and a silent observer, waiting for the true purpose of his unconventional life to reveal itself. The subtle currents of prejudice at Hawthorne Academy were a constant, suffocating hum, a background score to Jamal's daily life. He excelled academically, his mind a sponge for complex equations and historical narratives. Yet his intellectual achievements were frequently met with polite surprise or patronizing remarks from both peers and some faculty members. He was the anomaly, the dark-skinned boy from the orphanage who, against all odds, could grasp advanced calculus. This quiet resentment, this systemic refusal to acknowledge his inherent worth, festered within him, a slow burn that threatened to ignite. One Tuesday, during the weekly school assembly, the simmering tensions reached a boiling point. The headmaster, a portly man with a booming voice and an air of self-importance, was announcing the winners of the annual Hawthorne Spirit Essay Contest. The topic this year was community and belonging. Jamal had poured his heart into his essay, writing about the universal human need for acceptance, drawing implicitly from his experiences, but framing it in a way that resonated with the themes of unity. He hadn't expected to win, but he had hoped, perhaps foolishly, for some recognition. The third-place winner was announced, then the second. Finally, the headmaster cleared his throat, a theatrical pause for effect. "And the winner of this year's Hawthorne Spirit Essay Contest," he declared, "is Robert Sterling." A ripple of applause went through the auditorium, primarily from the mighty rows where Robert's clique, led by Marcus, sat. Robert, a lanky blond boy whose father was a prominent real estate developer in Hawthorne Hill, strutted to the stage with an air of entitled triumph. Jamal felt a familiar sting of disappointment, quickly followed by a sharp, cold realization. Robert's essay, he knew, had been a superficial rehash of platitudes, bland and uninspired. Jamal had proof. A few days prior, while in the library, Jamal had accidentally seen Robert's essay left carelessly on a desk. He had only glanced at it, but the memory of its generic phrases was stark against the vivid prose of his own. More critically, he recalled a distinctive, almost childlike doodle on the back of Robert's paper, a small, crude drawing of a knight. He dismissed it then. But now a suspicion, cold and sharp, pierced through his disappointment. Robert Sterling was notoriously lazy. His academic success often attributed to his family's influence rather than his own merit. As Robert began to read his winning essay, Jamal felt a surge of indignant anger. It was not just about the contest, it was about the insidious way the system worked, the way privilege consistently trumped talent, the way his efforts were always undervalued. He listened, his hands clenched, as Robert droned on, his words echoing the very sentiments Jamal had meticulously crafted. The humiliation from the orphanage, the subtle slights at the school, all coalesced into a potent desire for justice. This was not a minor slight. This was a public validation of mediocrity and an insult to intellectual integrity. Before Robert could finish, Jamal, propelled by an impulse born of raw indignation and years of suppressed frustration, stood up from his seat. The sudden movement, a ripple in the otherwise orderly rows of students, drew every eye. A hush fell over the auditorium, broken only by the headmaster's bewildered pause. Jamal's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of courage and fear. He swallowed hard. His voice, though trembling, rang out with unexpected clarity. "That's not his essay." A gasp rippled through the audience. The headmaster's eyes, usually placid, widened in shock. Robert, on stage, visibly blanched, his carefully composed smirk dissolving into a look of panicked disbelief. Marcus, from the back, let out a low whistle, a mix of surprise and grudging admiration. Jamal felt the weight of hundreds of eyes, the collective breath held in suspense. This was it. The silent endurance was over. "What did you say? Young man," the headmaster boomed, his face reddening. "Sit down immediately. Jamal Rivers." Jamal didn't sit. He took a steadying breath, remembering Eleanor's words, "Knowledge of his power and understanding the patterns allows one to anticipate and deflect." He had anticipated this systemic injustice, and now he was deflecting it head-on. "I said, that's not his essay," Jamal repeated, his voice gaining strength, infused with righteous anger. "I saw his actual essay in the library. It had a drawing on the back, a knight." The auditorium erupted in murmurs. Students whispered, some pointing at Robert, who now looked like a deer caught in headlights. The faculty members exchanged nervous glances. The headmaster, momentarily flustered, stammered, "Preposterous, Robert Sterling is an exemplary student. You are making wild accusations, Jamal." But Jamal pressed on, the dam of his suppressed emotions finally breaking. His essay was about the fabric of community and the tapestry of belonging. Mine was about the need for genuine acceptance, not just superficial inclusion. He looked directly at Robert, whose eyes now darted frantically around the room. "And I know his was about the importance of family legacy. Mine was about forging your own path." The headmaster, regaining some composure, attempted to shut him down. "That's enough, Jamal. You will be severely disciplined for this outburst." Just then, from the side door, Eleanor Graves entered the auditorium. Her presence, always striking, was particularly impactful in this formal setting. She wore a simple, dark dress, but her posture was ramrod straight, her gaze unwavering as she swept the room. Her eyes settling on Jamal. She didn't speak, didn't even smile. But the subtle nod she offered Jamal was a silent validation, a powerful affirmation that he was not alone. Her arrival, a tacit endorsement of Jamal's defiance, instantly shifted the dynamics. The faculty, accustomed to her eccentric but respected presence, hesitated. Eleanor slowly walked down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the hushed hall. She stopped beside Jamal, her hand briefly resting on his shoulder, a small but significant gesture of support. "Headmaster," she said, her voice clear and resonant, cutting through the lingering tension. Perhaps a simple verification would pend in order. The original submission of Mr. Sterling's essay, as well as Jamal's, should be readily available in the administrative office. The headmaster spluttered, caught off guard by Eleanor's direct intervention. "Ms. Graves, this is highly irregular. Irregularity, headmaster, often precedes truth," Eleanor countered, her eyes piercing. "And if an institution values integrity, then truth should be its highest pursuit, regardless of social standing." Her gaze swept over the students and staff, a silent challenge that dared anyone to contradict her. Under Eleanor's cool, unyielding stare, the headmaster, seeing the validity of her point in the increasing unease in the room, relented. "Very well," he conceded, his voice strained. "We will retrieve the essays and verify the claims." He dispatched a frantic-looking assistant to the office. The wait was agonizing, punctuated only by the low murmur of conversations in the heavy silence of anticipation. Jamal stood tall, Eleanor's hand still a reassuring weight on his shoulder. He felt a tremor in his knees, but it was not of fear, but of the raw, exhilarating power of speaking truth to power. He had chosen to fight, and he had Eleanor, his strange, brilliant mentor, as his unlikely ally. When the assistant returned, a sheaf of papers clutched in his trembling hand. The tension in the room was electric. The headmaster took the papers, his face grim, and began to review them. As he turned Robert Sterling's essay over, a small, crudely drawn knight, exactly as Jamal had described, became visible on the back. A collective gasp rose from the students. The evidence was irrefutable. Robert Sterling's face was ashen, his pretense completely shattered. He had been caught, his deception exposed not by a quiet, anonymous complaint, but by the defiant voice of the very boy he had tried to silence. The crudely drawn knight on the back of Robert Sterling's essay felt like a booming detonating in the silent auditorium. The headmaster, Mr. Harrison, clutched the papers, his face a mottled purple, a clear indication of his fury and utter mortification. Robert, pale and trembling, tried to shrink into himself on the stage, his gaze fixed on the floor. The collective gasp from the students was followed by a cacophony of whispers, a rising tide of shock and revelation. Jamal stood beside Eleanor, a tremor running through him, not of fear, but of an exhilarating, almost terrifying, power. He had dared to speak, and the truth, in its rawest form, was now undeniable. Mr. Harrison, recovering from his initial shock, slammed the papers onto the podium, the sound echoing harshly. This is an outrage," he blustered, his eyes darting frantically between Jamal and Eleanor, then settling on Robert. "Robert, what is the meaning of this?" His voice was laced with a desperate plea for an explanation. Any explanation that could salvage the institution's reputation, but Robert could only stammer, incoherent syllables escaping his lips. His facade of privileged nonchalance had crumbled, revealing a terrified, desperate boy. The headmaster's gaze then swung back to Jamal, now hardening into accusation. "And you, Jamal Rivers, to cause such a scene, to publicly embarrass a fellow student on mere speculation." He was attempting a desperate deflection, trying to reframe Jamal's courageous act as an act of malicious disruption. Eleanor, her hand still resting lightly on Jamal's shoulder, stepped forward, her voice a calm, unwavering counterpoint to the headmaster's bluster. "Speculation. Headmaster, the evidence is quite literally in your hand. The drawing on the back of the submitted essay belongs to Robert Sterling, as Jamal accurately described. Now, I suggest we compare the content, side by side." Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, challenged him to refuse. She held up a copy of Jamal's own essay, crisp and pristine, which she had evidently prepared beforehand. This foresight, this quiet readiness, further solidified Jamal's faith in her strange brilliance. A ripple of anticipation swept through the audience. This was no longer just a school disciplinary matter. It was a public trial, unfolding before hundreds of witnesses. The headmaster hesitated, clearly cornered. To refuse Eleanor's logical request would only confirm the suspicions already spreading like wildfire. With a frustrated sigh, he took Jamal's essay from Eleanor. He began to read silently, his eyes scanning back and forth between the two documents. As he read, his face grew paler, his jaw tightening. The similarities were glaring, undeniable. Robert's essay was indeed a thinly veiled rephrasing of Jamal's original ideas, stripped of its nuance and genuine emotion, yet undeniably derivative. "It's not just a drawing." "Headmaster," Jamal said, his voice gaining confidence, fueled by the mounting evidence and Eleanor's silent support. He looked directly at the headmaster, then at the assembled students and faculty. "Robert's essay talks about inherited legacy and civic duty stemming from generations. My essay talks about forging your own path and the challenge of building community when you start with nothing." His was about tradition. Mine was about transformation. Jamal's words were precise, cutting through the headmaster's attempts at obfuscation, highlighting the fundamental ideological differences that betrayed the theft. Suddenly, a woman from the audience, impeccably dressed and radiating an aura of frosty disdain, rose from her seat. It was Mrs. Sterling, Robert's mother, her face contorted in a mask of outrage. "This is preposterous," she shrieked, her voice shrill and piercing. "My son is an honorable boy. This is an attack, a malicious fabrication by that orphan." Her gaze flickered to Jamal, then to Eleanor, brimming with contempt. "He's obviously jealous. And this woman," she gestured dismissively at Eleanor, "is clearly unstable, exploiting a vulnerable child to cause trouble." Her words dripped with classism and thinly veiled racism, aiming to discredit Jamal and Eleanor by leveraging their social standing, or lack thereof. The atmosphere in the auditorium crackled with tension. Mrs. Sterling's outburst, rather than silencing Jamal, seemed to embolden him. He took a step forward, his voice clear and resonant, carrying to every corner of the room. "My mother taught me that character isn't bought, it's earned, and that stealing someone else's work, their ideas, is a betrayal of that character." He looked directly at Mrs. Sterling, his eyes unwavering. "This isn't about jealousy. This is about honesty, about fairness, something that seems to be missing in this school when it comes to people like me." The "people like me" hung in the air, a clear, powerful accusation of systemic bias, not just individual malice. Eleanor, seeing Jamal's conviction, tightened her grip on his shoulder, a silent encouragement. She then addressed the headmaster directly, her voice cutting through the rising murmurs. "Headmaster Harrison, the evidence of plagiarism is irrefutable, and Mrs. Sterling's attempts to deflect with personal attacks on Jamal's background only highlight the very prejudice that Jamal has been subjected to in this institution. Are we to teach these students that academic integrity is secondary to social status, that the truth can be conveniently ignored for the comfort of the privileged?" The headmaster, caught between the undeniable evidence, Eleanor's logical force, and Mrs. Sterling's hysterical demands, was visibly sweating. He knew the implications of this scandal spreading. The reputation of Hawthorne Academy, built on centuries of exclusivity and perceived excellence, was teetering on the brink. Other faculty members, witnessing the spectacle, began to look at Robert and Miss Sterling with a dawning realization, some with shame, others with thinly veiled disgust. The facade of the institution was crumbling, exposing the ugly underbelly of its biases. Suddenly, a quiet voice spoke from the front row. It was Mrs. Albright, Jamal's former matron from the orphanage, who had been invited as a guest for the essay contest. Her face was pale, her expression a mix of shock and dawning comprehension. "Jamal is telling the truth," she stammered, her voice surprisingly firm. He always was a quiet boy, but he never lied, and he always excelled in his studies. We, we often underestimated him. Her unexpected testimony, coming from someone who had initially contributed to Jamal's marginalization, carried an unusual weight. It was a small crack in the wall of institutional indifference. The headmaster knew he was defeated. The witnesses were too many, the evidence too clear. The moral high ground firmly occupied by Jamal and Eleanor. This was no longer a private disciplinary issue. It was a public indictment of the school's integrity and its implicit biases. The silence that followed Mrs. Albright's statement was deafening, pregnant with the weight of the moment. The power dynamics had shifted, dramatically and irrevocably. The racist power was now cornered, exposed, and forced to confront its own rot. The headmaster's defeat was palpable, hanging in the air alongside the heavy silence that followed Mrs. Albright's surprising declaration. Mr. Harrison, his face a mask of profound chagrin, finally cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. "Robert Sterling," he announced, his eyes refusing to meet the boys. "Your essay has been found to be plagiarized. You are hereby disqualified from the contest and suspended from Hawthorne Academy for the remainder of the academic year." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "Furthermore, the committee will review your previous academic records for any further discrepancies. And you?" He turned to Mrs. Sterling, whose face was a mask of disbelief and fury. "Your behavior in this assembly has been disgraceful and disrespectful to this institution." Mrs. Sterling gasped, her outrage momentarily eclipsing her shock. "Suspended my son. Do you know who I am? Do you know what kind of donations my family has made to this school?" Her voice rose to a shriek, but it lacked the authority it usually commanded, sounding instead like the desperate cries of a losing battle. Eleanor stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "Your donations, Mrs. Sterling, do not buy integrity, and your son's actions reflect poorly not only on him, but on the values this institution purports to uphold." Her calm, authoritative tone cut through Mrs. Sterling's hysterics, further solidifying the shift in power. The headmaster, sensing the tide had truly turned and wanting to mitigate further damage, spoke quickly, addressing the entire assembly. "Academic integrity is paramount at Hawthorne Academy. We condemn all forms of dishonesty, and we uphold the principles of fairness and respect for all students, regardless of background." The words sounded hollow, a desperate attempt to regain control. But the underlying message was clear: the school was being forced to acknowledge its failings. The ripple effect was immediate and dramatic. The student body, initially stunned, erupted in a flurry of whispers and exclamations. Many of Robert's friends, who had been quick to mock Jamal, now averted their eyes, some even slinking out of the auditorium. Others, particularly those who had secretly admired Jamal's quiet intelligence, looked at him with a newfound respect, a dawning understanding of the subtle injustices he had faced. The news, fueled by the sheer drama of the public confrontation, spread like wildfire through the privileged community of Hawthorne Hill. Smartphones, which had been discreetly recording the entire incident, quickly uploaded snippets to social media, bypassing the carefully curated public image of the academy. Within hours, the story was trending on local news outlets. "Plagiarism scandal rocks elite Hawthorne Academy." Read one headline, "Orphan exposes privilege and deception." Read another, the video clips, showing Jamal's unwavering stance, Eleanor's dignified support, and Mrs. Sterling's hysterical outbursts, went viral. Comments poured in, a torrent of outrage and support. Hatch justice for Jamal began a trend, fueled by ordinary citizens tired of seeing wealth and privilege override merit. The community's response was fractured but significant. Parents who had always been suspicious of the school's elitism and veiled biases now had undeniable proof. Some pulled their children out, citing a loss of faith in the institution's moral compass. Others, particularly those with less influence, expressed solidarity with Jamal. Emboldened by his bravery, there were still those who defended Robert, whispering about Jamal being a troublemaker or Eleanor being a manipulative old witch. But their voices were increasingly drowned out by the louder chorus of public condemnation. The fallout extended beyond Robert. Several faculty members, who had either participated in or silently condoned the subtle discrimination against Jamal, found themselves under scrutiny. Mr. Davies, the art teacher, who had made the innate rhythm remark, was quietly reprimanded and issued a formal apology to Jamal. Though it felt hollow, the admissions officer, Mrs. Albright's polished counterpart, faced an internal review regarding her unusual circumstances, comments, and was ultimately reassigned to a less public-facing role. The school board, under immense public pressure, announced a comprehensive review of its diversity and inclusion policies. A performative gesture, but one that acknowledged the undeniable systemic issues. For Jamal, the immediate aftermath was a whirlwind. He was no longer invisible. Students who had once ignored him now approached him, some with genuine apologies, others with a mix of curiosity and awe. The constant whispers still followed him. But now they were tinged with admiration rather than disdain. He was no longer the strange orphan, but the brave boy who stood up to injustice. This newfound attention was unsettling, but also validating. He saw the shift in the eyes of his peers, the tentative reaching out from classmates who had once dismissed him. Eleanor, ever the enigmatic figure, remained by his side. A silent sentinel, she fielded calls from journalists with curt, dismissive replies, but ensured Jamal was protected from the overwhelming media glare. She didn't offer praise, but her quiet presence, the way her gaze often rested on him with an almost imperceptible hint of pride, spoke volumes. She had set the stage, provided the tools, and now observed the unfolding consequences with an almost clinical detachment, yet with a profound understanding of the human drama at play. The true consequence, however, was not just Robert's suspension or the school's damaged reputation. It was the awakening in the community, the forced confrontation with uncomfortable truths, the carefully constructed facade of an inclusive, meritocratic institution had cracked, exposing the entrenched biases beneath. Jamal, an unlikely catalyst, had inadvertently forced a reckoning. He had not sought revenge, but justice, and in doing so, he had ignited a spark that threatened to illuminate the darkest corners of their gilded world. The silence that had once protected the privileged had been shattered by the voice of a boy who had finally decided to speak. And the echoes of that voice would reverberate for a long time to come. The dust settled, but the echoes of the Hawthorne Academy scandal reverberated far beyond the manicured lawns of Hawthorne Hill. For Jamal, the aftermath was a dizzying kaleidoscope of emotions and unforeseen opportunities. He was no longer just the orphan, nor merely Eleanor's peculiar ward. He had become a symbol, a reluctant standard-bearer for a nascent movement against ingrained prejudice. The shift was immediate, almost disorienting. Where once he had walked through the school hallways with an invisible cloak of otherness, now heads turned, not in disdain, but in recognition, sometimes admiration. Students who had once sneered now offered tentative smiles. Some even approached him, expressing a newfound understanding or offering clumsy apologies. The silence that had long surrounded him was broken, replaced by a constant hum of attention. Eleanor, ever the strategist, had anticipated this shift. She allowed a single, carefully curated interview with a respected local newspaper, ensuring Jamal's narrative was told accurately, devoid of sensationalism. The article, titled "The Boy Who Spoke Truth to Power," painted Jamal not as a victim, but as a courageous individual whose unwavering honesty had exposed systemic rot. Jamal, guided by Eleanor's quiet counsel, spoke with a maturity beyond his years, recounting his experiences at the orphanage, the subtle slights at Hawthorne, and the moment he decided he could no longer remain silent. He didn't express anger or bitterness, but a quiet, resolute desire for fairness, a plea for a world where merit was truly recognized, irrespective of skin color or socioeconomic status. The article, coupled with the viral videos, ignited a wildfire, social media, once a tool for his bullies, became a platform for his message. The hashtag had justice for. Jamal evolved into hash speak your truth, then had equity in education. People from all walks of life, inspired by his story, began sharing their own experiences of quiet discrimination and systemic bias. Teachers across the country shared stories of overlooked students, parents recounted struggles with biased school systems, and young people, often marginalized, found their voices through Jamal's courage. The story transcended a local school scandal. It became a national conversation about racial and class-based inequities in education. Jamal found himself deluged with messages, DMs, from other students who had faced similar situations, invitations to speak at local community centers, even requests for interviews from larger news outlets. Eleanor, ever vigilant, filtered these requests, selecting only those that aligned with their broader objective. She wasn't interested in fleeting fame, but in substantive impact. One evening, she placed a tablet in front of him, displaying a map dotted with hundreds of pins. Each pin represented a school, a community organization, or a group that had reached out, expressing a desire to implement fairer practices or to learn from Jamal's experience. "Your voice, Jamal," she said, her eyes intense, "is no longer just your own. It is a conduit." His first public speaking engagement was at a small community hall in a neighboring, less affluent town. The room was packed, a mix of parents, students, and community leaders. He spoke nervously at first, his voice wavering, but as he recounted the cafeteria incident, the art supply incident, and finally the assembly confrontation, a strange power surged through him. He saw recognition in the eyes of the audience, nods of understanding, tears of empathy. He spoke not just about his personal humiliation, but about the insidious nature of prejudice, the way it chipped away at dignity, the way it stifled potential. He emphasized the importance of speaking up, not just for oneself, but for those who couldn't. "Silence, he concluded, his voice ringing with newfound conviction, "is not protection, it is permission." A standing ovation erupted, prolonged and heartfelt. His message resonated, particularly with young people of color who had long felt invisible or unheard. He became an unlikely mentor, answering DMs late into the night, offering words of encouragement and strategies for navigating biased environments. He talked about using knowledge as a shield, about the power of documentation, about finding allies in unexpected places. He cautioned them against anger, advocating instead for strategic, evidence-based confrontation, echoing Eleanor's pragmatic approach. "Don't let their hate poison your purpose." He'd often write. Eleanor, meanwhile, used her formidable intellect and unexpected connections to leverage the public outcry. She met with educational reform advocates, legal scholars, and even a few sympathetic politicians who saw the potential for genuine change. She provided them with data, research, and anecdotal evidence of systemic discrimination, painting a stark picture of the challenges faced by underprivileged students. She spoke of the need for objective assessment criteria, for anti-bias training for faculty, and for robust support systems for marginalized students. She never mentioned her own past, but her insights were clearly informed by a deep understanding of power structures and their vulnerabilities. One significant development was the formation of the Equity in Education Initiative, a nonprofit organization spearheaded by a coalition of community leaders and parents, with Eleanor as a key advisor and Jamal as its youngest, yet most powerful. Voice. The initiative aimed to provide legal aid to students facing discrimination, to advocate for policy changes in schools, and to develop educational programs that fostered inclusivity and critical thinking. Jamal, with Eleanor's guidance, helped design workshops for students on self-advocacy and identifying subtle forms of prejudice. He helped create an anonymous online platform where students could report incidents of bias without fear of reprisal. He was rebuilding not just his own life, but contributing to the rebuilding of a fairer system. The boy who had once sought invisibility now stood in the spotlight, not for fame, but for purpose. The scars of his past remained, but they were no longer sources of shame. They were the crucible in which his courage had been forged. He still faced skepticism, still encountered people who doubted his motives or Eleanor's. But the groundswell of support, the tangible impact of his story, drowned out the dissenting voices. He had turned his humiliation into a powerful catalyst for change, a testament to the idea that even the most marginalized voice, when amplified by truth and conviction, could shake the foundations of established power. He was no longer just Jamal Rivers, the orphan. He was Jamal Rivers, the advocate, the awakening force. Months later, the murmurs of change had swelled into a roar, echoing across the nation. The Equity in Education Initiative, spearheaded by Jamal and Eleanor, had become a formidable force, its impact far exceeding their initial aspirations. The anonymous reporting platform, designed by Jamal, had exposed countless incidents of hidden bias, leading to official investigations in school districts previously thought to be unimpeachable. Anti-bias training programs, based on the curriculum Jamal had helped develop, were being adopted by schools, and legal aid was successfully challenging discriminatory practices in admissions and disciplinary actions. The quiet boy who had once endured daily humiliation had become a powerful architect of systemic transformation. The culmination of these efforts arrived in a grand auditorium, not unlike the one where Jamal had faced his public shaming. But this time, the atmosphere was charged with reverence, not ridicule. The event was the inaugural Pioneers of Progress Award ceremony, created by a National Educational Reform Foundation to honor those who had made significant strides in fostering equity. Jamal Rivers, barely 14, was the youngest recipient. The stage, bathed in soft, warm light, awaited him. Eleanor Graves, her gaze reflecting a rare and profound pride, sat in the front row, a silent anchor in his tumultuous journey. As his name was announced, a ripple of applause swelled into a standing ovation. Jamal walked to the podium, no longer the trembling boy who had once struggled to find his voice. He wore a simple, well-fitting suit, a symbol of his newfound confidence, but his eyes, deep and knowing, still held the wisdom of a seasoned survivor. The image of him, a young black boy, standing confidently before a diverse audience of educators, philanthropists, and media, was a powerful tableau of justice unfolding. He began by acknowledging Eleanor, his voice resonating with genuine gratitude. "To Ms. Eleanor Graves," he said, turning slightly towards her, "my mentor, my guardian, and the woman who taught me that true power lies not in conformity, but in the courage to challenge the status quo, even when it feels terrifying. Thank you for seeing me, for believing in me, and for showing me that unconventional paths can lead to extraordinary destinations." Eleanor offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a faint smile gracing her lips, a rare display of emotion from the enigmatic woman. Then he addressed the audience, his words clear, concise, and deeply moving. He didn't recount the individual slights, but rather painted a broader picture of the human cost of prejudice. "For too long," he began, his voice steady, "children like me have been told, explicitly or implicitly, that we do not belong, that our potential is limited by our skin color, our zip code, or our circumstances. We learn early to internalize the whispers, to shrink ourselves, to become invisible. But invisibility is a dangerous comfort. It protects us from the pain of rejection, but it also robs us of the mark of our own voices, our own truths." He spoke of the transformative power of empathy, urging the community to look beyond superficial differences. "Justice," he declared, "is not merely the absence of injustice. It is the active presence of fairness, of opportunity, of the unwavering belief that every child, regardless of their background, deserves the chance to shine. It is the recognition that our collective strength lies in our diversity, not in our uniformity." His words were not accusatory, but rather an invitation, a call to action for a better, more inclusive future. He recounted the profound lessons he had learned from Eleanor. Though he still did not fully grasp the depths of her past, he spoke of her insistence on critical thinking, on questioning assumptions, on the pursuit of knowledge as a liberating force. She taught me that fear is a choice, and that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. She taught me that sometimes the strangest connections lead to the most profound transformations. His gaze drifted towards Eleanor, a silent acknowledgement of the secret deal that had started it all, a deal that had delivered him not just a home, but a purpose. His closing message was a powerful crescendo. To every child who has ever felt invisible, unheard, or unworthy, your story matters. Your voice has power. Do not let anyone dim your light. Speak your truth. Seek your allies. And remember that even in the darkest corners, there are people who will see you, who will believe in you, and who will stand with you. He paused, his eyes sweeping over the rapt audience, a profound sense of peace settling over him. The path to equity is long, but it begins with a single brave step. Be that step. As he finished, the auditorium erupted in thunderous applause, a wave of emotion washing over the audience. People rose to their feet, tears streaming down some faces, hands clapping until they ached. It wasn't just applause. It was an affirmation, a collective awakening. The community, through Jamal's unwavering spirit and Eleanor's enigmatic guidance, had begun to truly respond, to confront its own prejudices, and to strive for a more equitable future. Later, as Jamal and Eleanor stood together, surrounded by well-wishers and journalists, a familiar face approached them. It was Mrs. Albright, the former matron from the orphanage, her eyes now filled with genuine remorse and pride. "Jamal," she said, her voice trembling, I am so sorry for everything. I truly underestimated you. You were always destined for greatness." She extended a hand, and Jamal, remembering her surprising testimony during the assembly, took it warmly. It was a small act of reconciliation, a symbol of the larger healing process underway. Eleanor, seeing the genuine connection, finally spoke about her own past, a whispered confession meant only for Jamal. "My full name is Eleanor Graves, formerly Eleanor Kincaid. I was a leading military technologist, betrayed by the very system I sought to protect. They framed me, buried my research, and forced me into hiding. My marriage proposal to you, Jamal, was a desperate attempt to find someone worthy, someone resilient, to inherit my life's work, a breakthrough technology that could change the world, a technology I called Project Nightingale. I needed a mind that could withstand adversity, a spirit that wouldn't break under pressure. I watched you, Jamal. I saw the quiet strength, the intelligence, the enduring hope. You were never meant to be my husband, but my heir, my true successor." Her words, delivered with a quiet intensity, revealed the extraordinary depth of their bond, the true purpose of her eccentricity. The secret deal was not a whimsical arrangement, but a strategic partnership for the greater good. A torch passed to a deserving heir. Jamal looked at her, understanding dawning, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place, the strange contraptions in her house, the cryptic remarks, her insistence on his studies, it all made sense. He wasn't just a boy who spoke truth to power. He was a boss chosen to wield a power that could change the world. The justice served that day was not just for him, but for countless others, and it was a beacon, lighting the path forward for a new generation. The poor boy had indeed married a 50-year-old woman in a secret deal, and now the world knew why, and the world was beginning to change. His story, etched in courage and conviction, left an indelible mark, a clear message that the fight for equity was far from over. But with voices like his, it was a fight that could finally be won.